Today, we dive into one of the most debated topics of our time: CRISPR gene editing technology. Join me and Neal Baer, MD, pediatrician, acclaimed television writer and producer, best known for ER, Law & Order Special Victims Unit, and author of The Promise and Peril of CRISPR, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. We'll explore the moral, ethical, and policy challenges posed by CRISPR technology, taking a critical look at the history of eugenics, particularly during the 20th century, where eugenics ideas both in Nazi Germany and the United States influenced forced sterilization and discriminatory practices. Could the advent of gene editing technologies bring us back to a time where genetic selection is misused again? With the input from leading philosophers and geneticists, we'll touch on what global regulations should look like, what lessons can be learned from controversial cases like the gene editing scandal in China, and what predictions experts are making about the future of human genetics. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Neal, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious. So you are a lecturer in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School, and you are also the author of The Promise and Peril of CRISPR. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So, curiosity, how did you just get involved, or how did you get so interested in CRISPR? We know it's like one of the most fascinating topics, obviously, of our century, but what drew you to the topic?
Actual personal experience. I am a pediatrician, and I did my training at Harvard Medical School as a medical student, and then at USC's Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. And I had patients who had sickle cell disease, which is a devastating genetic disease that causes sickling of the red blood cells and can lead to strokes in children who are 8 years old, horrible pain, horrible joint problems. And so when I started to look into new ways to treat diseases like sickle cell disease or beta thalassemia, CRISPR was a big hope. And now, cut to many years later, this was in the mid-90s when I was doing this as a resident. We can cure sickle cell disease using CRISPR now by turning on a gene called a fetal hemoglobin gene.
Wow, it's unbelievable.
There are 100,000 Black Americans in the United States with sickle cell disease, and it causes a much decreased lifespan, up to often 20 years less, with intractable pain throughout one's life. It's a really terrible disease. It's estimated there may be 8 million people, mostly Black people around the world, with sickle cell disease. So a cure is, profound.
For sure. It's life-changing. Are there guidelines right now we know medical companies and different organizations, and we also see CRISPR and the lifestyle aspect too of health and wellness right now creeping in. Are there any guidelines that we have globally with CRISPR? And can you maybe name a few and what they might be?
Sure. There are definitely guidelines that it's not allowed or legal to do CRISPR on germline cells. So the way CRISPR works is in two ways. What we call somatic, and that is looking at a cell and editing it and pasting in literally the proper sequence. And that allows people, for instance, with sickle cell disease to live a full life without the symptoms. That's only addressing the cells in their body, not their germ cells or their reproductive cells. Then there is germline editing, where we can edit, say, an embryo, and we can change the DNA so that if that person has children later, they will pass on the changes from the CRISPR. With somatic, like with sickle cell disease, you cannot pass on that change. But with germline, you can. And that's where we edit the embryo. This happened in China some years ago with a doctor who did this on an embryo that split into twins. And he modified receptor for HIV so that these twins would not be able to acquire HIV because their receptor for the virus was mutated. And we know this has happened in the past naturally, where there were a few people who were exposed to HIV who never got it because they had a mutated receptor cell. So this caused chaos and alarm when Dr. He did this because it hadn't been done, at least to our knowledge, before. And that raises all kinds of questions about changing human evolution, changing babies in utero, for instance. You have to do IVF and then implant the embryo. So there's a moratorium on doing germline editing, though there's discussion about maybe there are times when it can be done. I want to be clear that in most cases, we don't need to do CRISPR germline editing because we have other techniques. We have IVF, where we can look at an embryo and see if it has a genetic disease, if it's carrying Marfan's or Tay-Sachs, or Tay-Sachs, which is something that is always fatal. And then we wouldn't implant that embryo. Now, with germline editing, there is a scenario where only germline editing would work. And that is if parents are deaf and they want to have a hearing child and they carry a gene, they both carry a gene, and it's not uncommon for deaf people to marry. If they want to have a child who's hearing with certain genetic diseases, they can't. So they would have to use CRISPR. So this is being used as a reason to do editing of embryos, as opposed to editing DNA in somebody who has, say, sickle cell disease or beta thalassemia. And that's raising a lot of questions because, say, in 2015, there was a complete moratorium saying we cannot do germline editing. Now, amongst various international and national academies of medicine, they're saying maybe there's a time when we can. And other people are worried, scientists and ethicists, that once you start doing editing of embryos, it will snowball and we'll do more and more and more.
And we look at the ethical implications as well, right? There's so
Exactly.
many conversations of will we do it right? What will the future look like when we're doing this? What will humans look like?
Right. Exactly.
Now,
And also, is it safe? It's not, there
yeah.
are what we call off-target mutations still, where we look at a little sequence, we cut it out, we send in the enzymes, we cut them out, and we put in the proper sequence, the healthy sequence. Well, sometimes it does things down further on the DNA sequence, and we're getting better at preventing that. But our the makeup of our bodies is so complex and it has evolved over tens of thousands of years. There's reasons for people having sickle cell disease, for instance. And the reason is that if you're a carrier, you have to have it from both your mother and your father. It's a recessive genetic disease. You have a 1 in 4 chance, if both your parents have it, you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting it. Now, why would this evolve? And the answer is it's protective in some ways against malaria. So
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
if you're a carrier, you have more protection against malaria than if you don't. And unfortunately, the way evolution works, if you're one of the unlucky ones, the 1 in 4 who get it, you're going to suffer horribly for the rest of the society or the group who will benefit. So when we start to tinker and we start to, make twins resistant to HIV, we may be doing something else that we don't know. We think that people who have this mutation for the receptor for HIV may be more um, susceptible to West Nile virus or other viruses. So it's a complex uh, amalgamation that has formed over all of these years of evolution. And when we start to like pick and choose and, oh, we're going to make somebody who has high cholesterol have less cholesterol, what how are we thinking about the evolution of where we are? And then the other side of it, the ethical side, is there are two other issues. One is bioweapons. We can make bioweapons without CRISPR, but it can be easier to do, and it can be more accessible for many people. I'm a TV writer as well, and on my show Designated Survivor, which is on Netflix, the whole season 3, the last season, was dedicated to CRISPR and doing it for nefarious reasons. The other side of it is what we call enhancement. Will people who have the financial means be able to start to pick and choose traits for their children? Now, can they do that now? No, you can't even choose. Eye color is not one gene. It's multiple genes, but we're getting better and better at kind of focusing in. Like we know, for instance, the genes that mutations that cause people not to feel pain. So should we like to use that for soldiers? Purportedly, China and Russia are, doing research on that to make soldiers uh, not feel pain, to make them able to stay up more, to make them fearless.
There's so many things, and you've hit so many points that I had from biological warfare all the way down. We were talking about ethics. I would like to put a pin in the biological warfare conversation because I like to come back to that. But I think the really great point, I think one of the great points that you made was about, maybe we're supposed to have these types of diseases because if we end up, editing them out, then what are we acceptable or what other complications could happen? The other question, too, is we know that history is always repeating itself. We're kind of seeing a repeat of history to some degree, I would say within North America. But when we look at conversations of eugenics that happened both in World War II and then obviously in America,
Right.
isn't this a very similar conversation of eugenics, but in a more modern technological way? CRISPR could be editing out, different genetic conditions, different traits, and eliminating an entire culture at one point in time or race. This could be possible. So, is this kind of a more advanced way of people that would
Sure.
might be interested in eugenics? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. In our book, The Promise and Peril of CRISPR, we have a chapter by Rosemarie Garland Thompson, who is one of the most renowned people on disability. And she's a professor at Emory. And she writes about velvet eugenics. And what that is that we start to erase or get rid of or eliminate certain traits like Down syndrome or um, other genetic uh, situations, let's say, that are consonant with life. So, for instance, with uh, Down syndrome, many people decide to abort when they learn from amniocentesis or from um, uh, villi testing that they're carrying uh, a fetus with Down syndrome. They can elect to abort that fetus. Now, the question with Down syndrome is very complex because some children born with Down syndrome do extraordinarily well and they live very full lives. I worked with an actor on Law and Order Special Victims Unit that I did for 11 years, and she played a young woman with Down syndrome who was pregnant and didn't know how she got pregnant because this often happens to people with severe disabilities and they're sexually abused. And so she lived on her own. She sadly passed away a few years ago. Her name was Andrea Faye Friedman. She was on another series called Life Goes On from Alzheimer's, which can occur earlier in people with Down syndrome. But she led a very full life. She lived on her own and she acted. And so she's an example of someone with an inherited disease that does really well. Other children with Down syndrome may do very, very poorly, and we can't really predict. So, Rosemarie Garland Thompson writes about how, for instance, in Denmark, a person who's pregnant can get tested for free, and their numbers of babies with Down syndrome has really decreased. So should that be a goal of society that make perfect people? What is a perfect person? What is an ideal person? Is it a person who doesn't have Down syndrome? Is it a person who doesn't have cystic fibrosis? Sandra Sufyan in our book wrote a very interesting piece. She's in her 50s. She's a professor in Illinois, and she has cystic fibrosis. In the past, when I was in medical school in the early 90s, it was pretty astounding if someone lived into their 20s with cystic fibrosis. Now, with new medical treatments, they can. And so she writes about the powerful biosocial aspects of her life. In other words, she's very close with people with cystic fibrosis, and um, she's learned to live with it and have a full life as a professor. And she doesn't know if she would actually opt to not have her disease because she doesn't see it as a disease per se. She sees it as part of herself. Or a last example, Carol Padden, who also has a piece in our book, is a professor and dean at the University of California, San Diego, and she is deaf. And she writes that she doesn't see deafness as pathological at all. She sees it as human variation. And she is very much against going in and pathologizing deafness. And that's where it gets very complicated because, we see as physicians often deafness as something to be fixed. And Carol's arguing that it's a very personal decision. And this happens often in cases of whether someone gets a cochlear implant or not. And we did this on ER. So eugenics is really an important topic for CRISPR because it's expensive to treat people with, for instance, cystic fibrosis or sickle cell disease. It costs $1.6 million approximately for a lifetime of treating someone with sickle cell disease. Plus, it's a very, very painful, horrible disease. Who makes these decisions? Is it physicians? Is it the families? Is it the person who has the disease? There are people who argue that it is much cheaper to use CRISPR to eliminate these genetic diseases. And they do cause often horrible, horrible pain and suffering. There are some genetic diseases that always end in death, like Tay-Sachs or adrenoleukodystrophy. And no one would want a child to have that because we know the child will suffer and die very young. But we can prevent that because we test people, mostly people with Tay-Sachs are Ashkenazi Jews. And so we test them, and we've made it very clear to them that they can get tested. And if both partners are positive, then we can do in vitro and we can do amnio and we can prevent the birth of a child, of a fetus with Tay-Sachs. Because I would argue that no one would want a child with Tay-Sachs, though some people might be very religious and say that's God's will. But we do know, and I did this on SVU as a show, we do know those children will die and it is hopeless. So it is very complex. There are some genetic syndromes that are, perfectly consonant with life, and they might cause some pain. And then there are others that are really horrible. So who's going to make those decisions? And do we just go in and say we're going to cure everything we can? Now we can't do that yet with CRISPR. We can address diseases that are carried by the blood. And the simple reason is it's not so difficult to inject into the bloodstream to address blood-borne diseases like beta thalassemia or sickle cell. It's much harder to get into the lungs or into the muscle for, say, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. But there's a lot of work going on in this area.
Well, you're right. And I also think there is a sliding scale, right? if somebody is neurodivergent in any form or degree, it doesn't mean that that is some type of complication, right?
Right.
Or
Should we
anything that they're
fix it?
suffering from. It's just the way that their brain processes information. But also when you look at pain, nobody wants to be born in a world and then instantly know that within X amount of years they're going to be in utter pain. That's suffering. Right. So I think looking at the difference between people who think differently and look differently is very different than suffering. And maybe there's something we need to do on a global scale and have a global conversation with multiple different countries. And this is something that the United Nations or other organizations could get together and have these discussions about what are these guidelines? Do we look at suffering and then thinking differently? That is not neurologically, that is not a condition, right?
Right.
In the past, we would say that potentially it could be. Right. And people would say that people that were neurotypical would have a better life maybe than people that are neurodivergent. And that's not always true. We look at,
Right.
for example, autism. There is something called the telepathy tapes that is going around right now. It's been the number one podcast I think, on all major podcast platforms. And it talks about children that have autism and nonverbal autism, right? But they are still high functioning. They call them savants. But what they're finding out through these kids is that they're not savants. They're actually potentially reading their mind of their parent or their guardian and having these amazing capabilities. And, in the past, we would consider autism maybe as a challenge, but for them, it's not. And I think that we have to restructure the way that we look at being human. And we've had to do that multiple times, through World War II and until now, of how do we accept differences within society.
Right.
So my question to you now is looking at biohacking, right? We have CRISPR that looks at like editing from an embryo beginning, right, of an embryo. And then now we get into biohacking where we're able to to edit
Mhm.
out some of those things
Right.
while the person is still alive. What
Right.
are the subtle differences between the
Right.
two? And then when do we look at
Right.
using CRISPRing and when do we wait to biohack?
Right. So that is exactly the definition of somatic and germline editing. So the hacking, that word hacking would be where it's not where you're going in and using CRISPR to address, say, sickle cell disease. That person will still carry the gene for sickle cell disease, and they could pass it on to their child. But we can address the issue by turning on what's called the fetal hemoglobin gene. So we can do this with the somatic or biohacking. Germline is doing it with the embryo and changing the germline or the reproductive line so that that change is passed on. So that's the big difference. So for hacking, there have been these crazy cases on, you know, social media where people have gone in and tried to use CRISPR to change their musculature and give them bigger muscles or address like a disease, which has not been successful and is, not something that anyone should ever do. A good example of like, for instance, biohacking would be you can buy kits. I'm not sure if you can still do this online, but you could buy kits of tree frogs and you could make them into uh, giant tree frogs. So you could hack them, and you could also make fluorescent yeast, which kids do in high school. They use CRISPR and they're learning CRISPR, and there are DIY labs all over the world. We have a really great article in our book by the person who started um, DIY labs teaching CRISPR because she feels that it's important for the public to understand how it works. And what they do is they take yeast that they use for brewing beer and they fluoresce it by turning on fluorescent cells or putting in the fluorescent cells. And so you can see then that the yeast light up, and high school students do this. So there's also this tension of wanting people, the public, to understand it, but not wanting it to be able to go into, hackers' hands. So you asked about hacking, and this raises a big, big issue about oversight. So, and law. So it's not legal to do CRISPR with embryos in the around the world. And the doctor who did it in China was put in prison for, I think, 3 years. That doesn't mean that people still aren't going to do it. People jaywalk and it's against the law. I've had people from Nobel Prize winning labs tell me that they should be able to oversee their own, and that through, you know, becoming a pariah like Dr. He, that will stop people. But, people drive drunk and there are laws against it, and you'll have a good chance of going to jail. That doesn't stop people from doing bad things. So, how do we instate laws internationally and nationally? So, one thing is there's a lot of discussion about monitoring the companies that sell these DNA sequences. So you have to have a sequence in order to put it, you have to have the enzymes to cut out the mutation, and then you have to have the sequence to put in the correct sequence. And so you can buy sequences from different companies that make them. And there's a lot of discussion about overseeing what folks are buying. Because we know, for instance, the makeup of smallpox. We know the sequence of polio, smallpox, Ebola. So if somebody's buying certain sequences, they should be alerted. Feds should be alerted that there's problems going on, and they shouldn't be selling these sequences. And so we can monitor what's being sold, and that's in our book as well by two professors from Johns Hopkins, Rachel West and Gigi Granville, who talk about oversight, as well as another piece in our book. So we do handle all of these questions in The Promise and Peril of CRISPR, because it raises not just the issue of enhancement or super babies in the future, but bioweapons and oversight and who's going to make these decisions and velvet eugenics. So it's very complex. And it doesn't get the attention that AI gets, for instance, because AI is here. We can all go on ChatGPT. We can go on these platforms. It's changing the way we do research. And so it's part of our lives. But very few people have received CRISPR treatment. There have only been a few who've gotten the treatment for sickle cell disease so far. There are animals that have been CRISPR. There have been beagles that are these giant beagles. There's a lot of questions. We have another chapter in our book about experimenting on animals. Should we just make a chicken that's pretty much headless, that's just a hunk of meat? Is that what we should do? What about, transhuman editing, where we're putting human DNA into animals? Is there a chance that we could make animals more sentient? Animals feel pain, but can they know more as humans do about their environment and the impact that their environment has on them? So we start to raise these questions in that chapter as well. Where do we go with CRISPR for animals? Where do we go with it for plants? We'll be able to make plants maybe more resistant to drought. We'll have to consider that, of course. We might have to make plants more edible or digestible for human beings. We can't eat grass, but maybe we could put something into ourselves or into grass. So, these are somewhat, out there. Some might say far-fetched, but, we can't digest certain things, but maybe we can, but, cows can digest, grass. They have the enzymes to be able to do it. Should we be doing these kinds of things? As climate change is obviously here, as we see in Los Angeles now, tragically. So lots of questions on this topic, but very little discussion in our government. Have you heard?
And no, and that's a question I was going to ask you too, is looking at the political conversations. I have not heard anything. I think when CRISPR first was invented and was talked about, it was in the mainstream. It had this little blimp of everyone was talking about it, same with biohacking, and now it's very quiet. And you're right, it is AI. But at one point we will have the conversation again, and just hopefully it's not too late.
Right.
And the same thing that we look at AI in the same way that we look at any type of advanced technology, especially social media, the one thing that we should learn from is that, especially with social media, we never had any political guidelines or structures or anything like that or policy around certain decisions we made about implementing social media into the mainstream world, right? So that, and within globally around the world, and what those implications could be, and what are some of the control mechanisms that we do need to have with in regulations with these corporate companies, because they have so much influence. And now we see that obviously within American and Canadian politics, that social media is immensely influenced political decisions from just the voters to the politicians. So I do think that we need to have guidelines around this. We look at the conversation too of abortion rights. This would go hand in hand with a political conversation as well. Do you feel that's kind of where this might be going? And would a political party attach themselves like they have with the Republican Party and some of the Republicans, I should say, agreeing with abortion and anti-abortion rights?
Right.
So do you feel that this would kind of be hand in hand potentially with a Republican conversation down the road?
Oh, absolutely. Because one thing you need with CRISPR is IVF if you're going to do germline editing. In other words, if you're going to affect an embryo that carries deafness and make it not carry deafness, then you can only do this through IVF because germline is changing the reproductive cells. In other words, that it's going to be passed on through the germline. And so we're changing all of the cells. Whereas in sickle cell disease, we're turning on fetal hemoglobin. We're not affecting the reproductive cells. So that's a big difference. So I could imagine there's been a lot of conversation about banning IVF amongst Republicans and Republicans on the far right, particularly.
Right.
So that will come up again, I'm sure, over the next 4 years, and that would put not only brakes on germline, which there already are brakes on, but it would put brakes on preventing genetic diseases in fetuses because if you can't do IVF, then you can't then it's a roll of the dice whether if you're a carrier of a genetic disease like Tay-Sachs and you have a baby and you can't do IVF or you can't do abortion, then you're going to be having babies with terrible diseases that are fatal. So it's very, complex, and it's like, and it's also, to be crass, very expensive. Not only is it horrible for the families and for the child suffering, but it's very expensive to take care of a child who is going to die, no matter what you do, and they're going to suffer. So how do we think about this? You brought up another really important point about not predicting the future. So if we look back on technological advances like plastic, for instance, like plastic was going to change the world, and it did. It allowed so many things, in our everyday life, like from bottles of water to all kinds of devices and things like that. But plastics are made, of course, out of fossil fuels, and microplastics are now starting to get a lot of attention. Why are young people having higher rates of colon cancer and other kinds of cancer? Is it because of ultra-processed foods and the chemicals in these foods? Is it because of pesticides? Is it because of microplastics? And so we don't know the answers yet, but we do know from data that young people are getting higher rates of cancer. So we didn't know that plastics, that there would be 20 to 40 billion, you know, plastic bottles, in the oceans every year. When plastics were first made and we were turning in our Coke bottles for refunds. But now we see what the consequences are. So, being able to predict consequences of burning fossil fuels. Yes, we knew, and the oil companies knew in the 70s and suppress the data, and this is well known, about climate change. But we didn't know, at the turn of beginning of the 20th century necessarily what the outcomes would be. Um, but we knew that these were technological advancements. So, um, how do we know what CRISPR is going to be? We don't. So we have to be very careful about going down this path because we look at history to see that things that were embraced, nuclear energy. Well, then 3 Mile Island came, and now we're talking about nuclear energy again. But, or even in California, we're hearing this in Los Angeles. This is a really good example. LA was prepared for a fire. They just weren't prepared for 4 fires at once. Well, Three
Fair
Mile
enough.
3 Mile Island was prepared until sort of the unthinkable happened and there was the meltdown and all of that. So how do we prepare? How do we know? Well, we can't. So we have to go in with an attitude of kind of awe that we have to be very careful. And that's in conflict with the money that can be made. How much does it cost to get treated uh, with CRISPR? Well, it's, between $1 and $2 million to get the treatment. So
Wow.
who's going to pay for this? It's a very intensive treatment for a very horrible disease. So who's going to pay for it? So, as I said, 100,000 people have it. So we have these really complex questions. And, there's this force. There's a fantastic, I think, one of the most powerful pieces in our book is by an ethicist at Arizona State University named Ben Hurlbut. And he writes that um, ethics follows the science rather than science following the ethics. And by that he means, and he looks at Dr. He and he says that Dr. He was under a lot of pressure. Dr. He studied in the United States at Rice and at Stanford. And Dr. Hurlbut reports that Dr. He, who made the twins resistant to HIV and was put in prison, was pressured and told, you could become super famous. You could win the Nobel Prize. There, this is pretty profound because Hurlbut says the Americans knew that they couldn't do it. So he suggests that there was pressure put on Dr. He to do it because the idea was once it's done, you break that barrier down and then you go forward. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, in 2015, there was moratorium. We need to discuss CRISPR, germline editing, CRISPR amongst society. How we do that is a big question. And then after Dr. He, it's like, well, maybe there are times when germline editing is okay. What if both parents have Huntington's disease? What if these very, very extremely rare instances? And then they started to come up with something that was a little less rare, which was deafness. And so Hurlbut makes a really important point. I think the most important in our book is that instead of the ethicists having the conversation with the public and then doing the science does something, and then we say, well, okay, now that it's been done, maybe there are times that we can do it. And then it gets done again. Oh, okay, maybe there are times we can do it. So this is really critical to have this conversation. And how do we have conversations? I have ideas about how we can have these conversations, but that's, I think, really critical that science typically follows ethics, I'm sorry, typically follows the science as opposed to maybe the way it really should be, which is science following the ethics, because scientists don't want to be told what to do and what they can and can't do. That's why they want to have self-regulation.
Right,
I'm
which
against that.
is very scary too, because who
Exactly.
knows if they're making the ethical conversation or the
Of
ethical
course.
decision, proper decision. But now going back to the biological warfare concept, because we put a pin in that earlier. We look at countries like North Korea, right? They have their own dictatorship, they have their own way of thinking. The West is bad, they are good, right?
Right.
When we look at countries that are self-contained, like North Korea. We can't have access to them. We can't get in. And if someone does and someone ends up publicizing it, they end up going to a working camp if they're caught in North Korea. So, and it's been like that for so long, for decades now, right? Gosh, I believe it's been decades because of
Yes.
the Young family or
Mhm.
the Jung family.
Mhm.
So with that, you could have generations after generations. And if looking at countries like North Korea having access to CRISPR, if they do or not, we don't even know yet, and being able to create their own society, right? And be able to create the specific human that they feel is ethically right and what they want. The challenge with that is we cannot control it because we have no access to North Korea, in fear of obviously nuclear warfare. But that conversation of being able to develop your own type of superhuman or human that they feel is appropriate for Earth would be able then to do exactly what World War II did and be able to then potentially, breed that or take it across the
Right,
world and be able to conquer
right.
different countries and cities. So you are very right. I think
Yeah,
that when we look at it just as biological warfare, by dropping, let's say, just something that could be from a biohacking element to affect a population or culture, all the way down to then creating a type of culture that they feel is superior than the human race right now.
right,
And
right.
that is, it's petrifying. And you are right. It
Yes,
is the conversations we should be having now. We should have
yes.
had them yesterday, really.
Exactly. And I think people who do CRISPR research would say, oh, that's ridiculous. We can't make superhumans. And if that is true, we can't. But there are things we can do. And in order to get to points in the future, we have to do certain things now. And whether we should do those things or not is a very important question. That's why we have these conversations about Iran and nuclear weapons, because we can't really oversee. I mean, there's spies, there's all kinds of things going on, but we want to prevent Iran having nuclear capabilities. Um, how do we do that with North Korea? How do we do that with Russia? And so, it's the same kind of question. How do we prevent? Now, people might argue who do this kind of research that you don't need CRISPR for bioweapons. So that's like, but my argument would be, but it can help. It can make it easier. And so that's, I think, a straw man argument that, you can do it other ways. Well, yes, but this is another way to do it that might be more um, easily placed into people's hands who shouldn't have it. Rogue scientists. How do we stop a rogue scientist, a crazy person who decides they want to make Ebola pox? I mean, so how do we do this? And so this is where instead of being, you know, um, running away from the world and being isolationist, as Trump would maybe have us, that now is the time for us to be actually more globalist, more involved, so that we can prevent these things from happening. And it takes a lot of thinking, a lot of conversation um, to um, to get to this. I mean, one thing I've said to AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, that um, produces one of the best journals around, which is Science Magazine, is that maybe we should put scientists in cafes, in Starbucks, in places where people can just have conversations. How do we encourage conversations apart from this, where there's so much misinformation? How do we stop that? And so, or how do we address that? And so, what are some interesting, creative ways of placing people in conversations? How do we draw on? And this is what I have a master's degree program that I created at Harvard Medical School in media, medicine, and health. And my graduate students create projects drawing on the arts, broadly defined: dance, poetry, documentaries, fiction, nonfiction, essays, photography, to improve health. So, how do we start telling stories through the arts and humanities and media about CRISPR? So, I did it on my series Designated Survivor in the third season, about using CRISPR in nefarious ways. But that was one show. But, I encourage my students to think about how to draw on the arts to um, and humanities and media to tell stories, because stories are what change people's minds. Think about the movies you've seen or TV shows where you may have had another perspective and it made you think. And so that's what I think one thing that we can do to address all the bad things I've been talking about for the last almost 45 minutes is now how do we address it? How do we, from the perspective of oversight and legally and talking about it to, the arts and humanities.
I agree. I really do agree. And I think that the conversations you're saying, having scientists go into cafes and just start listening and talking to people, you could have organizations working with specific not for profits that could go into tons of different communities and host lectures and get people to
Right,
talk and open forums and roundtables.
right,
Everybody loves a good forum if they love to talk and they want to express their ideas and have a contribution to what society will look like in the future. Then you're right. I think get off social media, get people together, get people connecting. And so
right,
that you see it on their face and you see how they're expressing themselves and what it means to them. You can't see that through a digital platform.
right,
So you're right. I think it is taking
right.
scientists or just academic institutes around the world and having these global conversations and making it real because we have to stop getting away from digital. And we do really have to start reconnecting again because that's what it's about. And I think we are somewhat, about 20 or 30 years away from social media really changing because of VR, right? We'll have this probably mixed reality, which again will have its own complications, but it might take us out of, being this cyborg holding a phone into it being mixed into our reality. And that again is a conversation about transhuman to some degree too, but there might be positives in that where we're getting out of just looking down and instead we're looking up and we're actually connecting with each other using these tools. But
Well,
you're
that's
right,
what
it is
we
our
evolved
choices
to.
now. There are very
We
light and
evolved.
dark sides of this. Yeah. And it's our
Absolutely.
choices that we make today that will obviously reflect tomorrow and the rest of the generations to come.
Well, we evolved as storytellers.
Yes.
We
Yeah.
evolved to listen and talk to each other. And we have a lot of research on how people's minds change, not through social media, not through shaming, not through saying you're an idiot or you're wrong or you're bad or you're good, but through conversations where we bring up our fears, our anxieties, our anger, and have conversations as opposed to having someone rev up our anger or our fears and then having it supported in social media where you're not really talking, you're just like, you know, spraying thoughts into the echo chamber. You can go on X right now and look up, the fires in LA and you'll see how it's politicized. And some people are saying, it's the fault of Gavin Newsom, and the others are saying it's the fault of the world and climate change and the oil companies, and lots of negative, nasty comments to each other because you don't even know whom you're talking to. Um, it's really, we're at a real inflection point. Um, and CRISPR, I think, can help us start to talk about these things in ways that generate conversations not only about CRISPR, but about AI, about nuclear energy, about bioweapons. And, I'm not against somatic gene editing at all. I want people to be cured of sickle cell disease. I want them to be cured of beta thalassemia and things that really have a terrible impact on their lives. It's just that it's not just an easy either or of, someone with Down syndrome, someone with Turner syndrome, someone with these are syndromes that are compatible with life. Women who have Turner syndrome only have one X chromosome. So they're infertile, they're short stature. Are they female? They don't have a Y chromosome, a male chromosome, they just have one X. And we have all these conversations now about transness. I think transness, it's interesting, is kind of coming out of a lot of these fears about, you know, what the future may be. And we see with people who are trans a transformation, and that scares people. And then they say, well, you can't possibly be trans, even though you can only know what transness is if you're trans. And so um, we're in a really, to have our country focused over and over um, with the Republican Party talking about transness, a very few number of people and trans women in sports is, I think, kind of an ostrich approach to dealing with really tough issues that are facing everyone, like the fires, global warming, nuclear energy, nuclear weapons. And so what's happening? Laws are being passed across many states about trans people when we have issues that are so profound that affect so many people, and then to say that transness affects my daughter in sports. Well, first of all, the number of trans women in sports is minuscule. And secondly, I argue with people about this, and it's an interesting argument, which is sports aren't fair. If you're 5'9" and a young woman who wants to be a gymnast and really compete, you can practice 10 hours a day. You'll never, ever be able to win like Simone Biles because you have to be built like Simone Biles. You have to be built like Michael Phelps to be the champion swimmer. And if you're 5'4" and you practice all day long, is that fair? Is it fair that Michael Phelps is built the way he is? It's the genetic roll of the dice. Is it fair that Simone Biles? That's life. And if you develop a sport that is focused on certain physical attributes, then it's not going to be, quote, fair to other people who may be passionate about it, but they can't compete. Even if they're great athletes, you cannot win in swimming unless you're built like Michael Phelps. And so this whole
It's not a
argument,
gender conversation. It's a
no,
genetic conversation. Yeah.
exactly. And
Yeah.
so, yes, there might be a couple of trans women swimmers who will win, but that's because they're built to be that kind of swimmer. But they're not winning all the time, and the number of trans women who are winning in sports is very small. So this is like a smokescreen for fear and
Right now, I think we see people are attacking trans people. You're right, because it's based out of fear, right? They don't want to see society change because they don't feel it will represent them correctly, or they just don't feel that it's ethically the right way to go, right? And it's unfortunate because I think trans people, there will be a moment for sure where the conversation switches from them and it goes to something else, right? It will be focused on somebody else. It's just the way it happens. It will be embedded into society, which obviously trans people are in the mainstream and should be, and always should have always been there and always will be. But I think sooner or later it will go to another topic, right?
will it go
And
to
it
like
right.
CRISPR, will it go to people with Down syndrome? Shall we say, well, no more Down syndrome. It's not what we
Well,
want as a society. It's expensive. They take too much time and energy, et cetera. So who's next?
you're right. Who's next is the conversation. And I think there has to be world organizations that have these conversations with political figures, because I don't think it's politicians who should be making these decisions. It should be world organizations working with humanities, different types of humanities, and obviously different types of hard sciences, so that they can have an integrated approach and a global approach. And politics needs to step aside until it's implemented in a way where policy does reflect all. Right. But I think there has to be a guideline that's created through other organizations without
Right.
interfering. Neal, thank you so much. Such a
Thank you.
wonderful conversation. Thank you. And, hopefully in the future, hopefully you and I see a world where there's will be darks and light sides of CRISPR. Hopefully we will be living in a world where we end up being on the lighter end of it. So thank you so much for joining me today. And as I say to my guests, thank you so much for being rebelliously curious with me.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.